on November 21st, 2025. The first stage of SpaceX's third-generation Starship rocket exploded during a test, causing severe tearing of the hull at the location of the liquid oxygen storage tank. This first stage rocket adopted a brand new designed propellant system, so the main purpose of this test was to verify the structural strength of the new system. As a result, no propellant was loaded, and the explosion range was relatively small. However, it was clear that the strength of this new structure failed to meet the requirements. It was clear that the strength of this new structure failed to meet the requirements, leading many of suspect that the progress of the US lunar landing program would be delayed once again. In this episode, we're going to talk about the current status of lunar landing programs of China and the United States. In February 2004, China's Lunar Exploration Program, also known as the Chang'e Program, was officially launched. It is a new generation space program carried out in a step-by-step manner after China achieved manned spaceflight. After China achieved the manned spaceflight, proposed jointly by aerospace experts in 1991, the program underwent feasibility studies and a project design organized by the Commission of Science, Technology, and the Industry of National Defense in 1998. The completion of technical schemes and overall planning were completed in 2002, and the project was officially approved and initiated in 2004. The entire process was extremely rigorous. Yet somehow, almost simultaneously, the United States suddenly stepped forward with a new vision for space exploration, namely the Constellation Program. For more than 30 years after the termination of the Apollo program, the US had remained relatively quiet in the lunar exploration arena. But just a few days before the approval of China's Chang'e program, the US suddenly announced its plan to return to the moon. This inevitably brings to mind a piece of history. In April 1961, the Soviet Union achieved a great success in manned spaceflight by sending cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin into space, while American astronaut Alan Shepard only entered space in May of the same year. At first glance, it might seem like no big deal. The US was merely a month behind, implying that the two countries were roughly on par in terms of technology. In reality, a closer look at the details reveals a world of difference between the two missions. The Soviet Union's spacecraft reached the first cosmic velocity, thus achieving orbital flight. During the 108-minute mission, Gagarin completed a full orbit around the Earth, with a perigee of 117 kilometers and an apogee exceeding 300 kilometers. In contrast, the US Mercury spacecraft fell far short of the first cosmic velocity, less than one-third of it. In fact, consequently, it failed to enter orbit. The entire flight lasted a mere 15 minutes, with only 5 minutes spent in space, and it reached a maximum altitude of less than 190 kilometers, just barely surpassing Gagarin's minimum orbital altitude. Moreover, its flight duration was less than 6% of Gagarin's. The spacecraft's trajectory was a simple parabola, which can be likened a souped-up anti-aircraft artillery shell. Technically speaking, it did enter space, but comparing it to the Soviet mission feels rather odd. It's like a high jumper telling a passing bird, "Look, I can fly too." For comparison, in 2003, China's first manned spaceflight mission sent Yang Liwei into Earth orbit. He orbited the Earth 14 times, spending over 21 hours in space and completing a series of scientific experiments before returning safely. This fruitful mission made China the third country in the world to achieve manned spaceflight. It is worth noting that after China's successful manned spaceflight, many countries around the world rolled up their sleeve and announced their own manned space program. The US proposed the Constellation program and later the Artemis program, vowing to return to the moon in the 2020s. Russia has released multiple manned lunar loading roadmaps but has postponed them year after year. Japan planned to send astronauts to the moon and collaborated with the US to develop a lunar rover. India listed a manned lunar landing as a long-term goal. South Korea announced its ambition to achieve manned lunar landing by 2045. Even Turkey and Egypt has released their own manned spaceflight visions. Yet, more than 20 years later, most of these programs have either been repeatedly delayed or have not even entered the engineering phase. To this day, only the US, Russia, and China have successfully accomplished manned spaceflight. Going back to 1961, the US was thoroughly humiliated by the Soviet Union's achievement. President JFK hastily consulted with the head of NASA. NASA Administrator James Webb suggested sending a man to the moon, arguing that this would undoubtedly outdo the Soviet Union. 2 weeks after Shepard's return to Earth, JFK delivered a televised speech declaring that the US would land a man on the moon within a decade. From today's perspective, this plan was incredibly crazy. It would be equivalent to China aiming to land on the moon by 2012, just 9 years after Yang Liwei's maiden spaceflight in 2003. Unsurprisingly, no one believed it was feasible, including the Soviet Union, which merely wished its American counterparts success. This leads us to the conclusion that the US lunar landing was an out and out prestige project. The fact that there were no follow up missions for more than 30 years after the Apollo landings further supports this view. In this lunar landing speech, JFK publicly stated that this is a time to embark on this long duration race, clarifying the goal of this space competition. In contrast, China spent 6 years conducting comprehensively demonstrations and preliminary research for its lunar exploration program before officially approving and launching it. The US, on the other hand, took a mere 2 weeks to make the decision. It is hard to argue that this was a scientifically sound process. Whoever claims that the US makes decisions slowly, through endless deliberations and with low efficiency, clearly hasn't seen this example. It couldn't have been faster. However, the problem was that JFK himself lacked confidence in the project. Faced with numerous difficulties after the plan was launched, in September 1963, the president summoned Webb, according to US archives declassified in 2011. Webb made it clear that the lunar landing could not be accomplished within JFK's term in office, and that the current budget was far too small and needed to be substantially increased. JFK angrily retorted that if Webb only wanted scientific data, he could simply send scientific instruments to the moon. Sending a man there was nothing more than a publicity stunt, and by no means worth spending billions of dollars on. Of course, JFK probably never anticipated that the Apollo program would eventually cost nearly 28 billion US dollars, accounting for approximately 1% of the US GDP at that time. In an attempt to cut costs and reduce pressure, 2 days later, JFK proposed to the United Nations that the US and the Soviet Union should cooperate on a joint mission to the moon. In October, Nikita Khrushchev responded, stating that the Soviet Union had no immediate plans for a lunar landing and was not willing to send humans to the moon without sufficient prior research and demonstration. With no other options, the US had to follow through on the bold promise it had made. In November, JFK stated in a speech that we have no choice but to press forward with the plan. The day after the speech, JFK was assassinated while riding on an open-top limousine, an unimaginable tragedy in the literal sense. Little did he know that he would not live to see the lunar landing during his term, nor would he witness it posthumously. Understanding this piece of history helps us make sense of why the US suddenly proposed the Constellation program in 2004. It was simply business as usual, a matter of needing to be the winner at all costs. In December of that year, President George W. Bush officially signed the New Generation US Space Transportation Plan. The following year, NASA formally announced its intention to return to the moon for exploration by 2020. A comparison of the decision-making process behind the two US lunar landing programs reveals stark differences from China's approach. In China, scientists first put forward the initiate concept, then conduct feasibility studies, formulate a comprehensive plan, submit an application for approval, and only after receiving official authorization do they announce the launch of the project. This is a bottom-up process. In contrast, the US approach is top-down. The president and the NASA administrator make a snap decision, announce the launch of the project, and only then assign their subordinates to study its feasibility and apply to Congress for funding. This approach inherently carries extremely high risks. Unsurprisingly, the Constellation program ended in complete failure just a few years later. In 2009, the US Congress launched an investigation into the program, which concluded that the existing funding plan was completely insufficient to support a return to the moon, and that continuing the program would require a massive injection of additional funds. It is unclear how exactly this conclusion was reached, but the fact remains that the Constellation program ultimately cost over 12 billion US dollars and achieved nothing tangible, leaving behind only two unfinished projects: the Ares rocket, which was essentially scrapped, and the Orion spacecraft, which was later absorbed into subsequent programs. In contrast, the total budget for the first three phases of China's Chang'e program by 2020 was only a fraction of that amount, only 2 billion US dollars. One can only say that the relevant US officials were far too extravagant with taxpayer money. Of course, the US spending on lunar landing efforts extends far beyond the Constellation program. In February 2010, President Obama officially announced the cancellation of the Constellation program. Not only did the US fail to return to the moon by 2020, but also lost its independent manned spaceflight capability. For the following decade, the US had to rely on Russia's spacecraft to send astronauts to the International Space Station. This embarrassing situation finally came to an end in 2020 with the successful launch of SpaceX Crew Dragon spacecraft. Meanwhile, in 2007, China's Chang'e 1 was officially launched, marking the first step of the three phases: orbiting, landing, and returning lunar exploration project. In 2013, the Yutu rover successfully landed on the moon. In 2018, Yutu number 2 touched down on the far side of the moon, and in 2020, Chang'e number 5 completed the sample return mission, bringing the three-phase project to a successful conclusion. Between 2010 and 2017, the United States allocated the annual funding that exceeded the total budget of China's lunar exploration program, yet only accomplished two things. First, the Orion spacecraft, co-designed by Lockheed Martin and Airbus Defence and Space, was selected as a designated crew vehicle for the Constellation program. However, not a single Orion spacecraft was launched throughout the implementation of Constellation program. After the program was terminated, NASA continued the Orion development, conducting a test flight in 2014 to keep the project afloat and secure more funding. Despite sporadic progress updates over the years, the Orion program was ultimately ordered to halt by Trump in 2025 due to the budget constraints. The second undertaking was the development of Space Launch System rocket, SLS in short. To cut costs and boost efficiency, the SLS abandoned many unrealistic advanced technologies in favor of mature, reusable ones, even refurbishing and repurposing old engines from the Space Shuttle era. Predictably, the project ended up with the classical outcome of cost overruns and efficiency shortfalls, according to a report by NASA's Office of the Inspector General. By 2022 alone, the combined cost of the Orion spacecraft and the SLS rocket has exceeded 50 billion US dollars and was projected to reach 90 billion US dollars by the end of 2025. The only tangible achievements was the 25-day uncrewed circumlunar flight test of the Orion spacecraft atop the SLS rocket in 2022. I highly suspect that within 90 billion US dollars, China could already fund a Mars landing mission. For the sake of humanity's grand aerospace endeavors, I suggest the United States set aside selfish motives, take the lead, and entrust the resources to the more efficient party. Interestingly, the main driving force behind this so-called achievement of NASA was none other than Donald Trump. In 2017, during his first term, Trump launched an all-around competition with China and announced the plan to return to the moon, tasking NASA with its execution. NASA responded that with sufficient funding, the goal could be achieved in about a decade, around 2028. But Trump retorted, "I don't have time to wait. You must land on the moon by 2024. Presumably, Trump calculated his potential re-election. 2024 would be the final year of his second term, allowing this lunar landing to be immortalized as his political legacy. In 2019, NASA gritted its teeth and agreed, declaring its intention to land humans on the moon by 2024 and by Mars by 2030. The lunar landing program was officially named Artemis. NASA held the program's biggest highlight as sending the first female astronaut to the moon. Looking back, it is evident that the Apollo program, the Constellation program, and now the Artemis program, all three consecutive lunar landing initiatives, are blatant prestige projects initiated by politicians, with none prioritizing scientific research. Unsurprisingly, the Artemis program has been fraught with setbacks. In 2021, NASA announced that a 2024 lunar return was completely unfeasible, pushing the landing back to 2025. In 2024, NASA stated that a 2025 landing was impossible, delaying it to 2026. In 2025, NASA claimed that a 2026 landing was out of the question, rescheduling it to 2027. And with 2026 not even here yet, NASA has already begun hinting at another delay to 2028. For the so-called world's leading aerospace power to fail so miserably at estimating project timelines is nothing short of a joke. Frankly speaking, anyone could make such time projections. It reeks of embezzlement of research funds. This stands in stark contrast to the 1960s, while the Apollo program suffered from severe cost overruns. It strictly adhered to its schedule despite numerous challenges. Between 1965 and 1966, the Saturn rockets experienced consecutive explosions. Thomas Barron, a safety inspector in charge of audits, pointed out in his report that the Apollo program was making extremely slow progress. The problems that emerged in the previous 2 years remained unresolved. Team members worked in silos with little communication, and technical personnel was constantly shuffled between positions, leaving them clueless about their roles. Equipment often had to be operated by engineers themselves, with no one taking responsibility for critical issues. Safety protocols were extremely lax, and systematic work record was lacking. Virtually no task was completed without deviations. In short, the whole operation looked like a ramshackle, disorganized mess. Inevitably, a catastrophic accident soon occurred. During a ground test in 1967, a sudden fire erupted in the rocket's command module, killing 3 astronauts. One would expect any rational country to hold operations for rectification in the wake of such a tragedy. The accident investigation report also pointed out that the entire spacecraft was riddled with severe flaws that required a complete redesign. Even NASA Administrator James Webb was forced to admit that completing the project on schedule was impossible, as more problems would emerge as development progressed. In 1968, Webb, the very man who had strongly persuaded Kennedy to pursue the lunar landing, mysteriously abandoned his dream and resigned. But just 3 days after Webb's resignation, the United States announced the successful first crewed test flight of Apollo 7 over the next 6 months. NASA launched the 3 more spacecraft, Apollo 8, 9, and 10, then in 1969, despite never having conducted an uncrewed test of the command module's lunar liftoff capability. Apollo 11 directly carried astronauts to the moon and succeeded. Chris Kraft, former director of the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston, noted that if the United States had not made such a bold public promise beforehand, the Apollo program should have been suspended for rectification after the fire. However, failing to meet the deadline would have made the US a laughingstock, so the program had to forge ahead. Without a doubt, the problems faced back then were far more severe than those plaguing the Artemis program today, yet they were somehow all resolved within 2 years. It can't possibly be a hoax, can it? In contrast, the Artemis program has already burned through 90 billion US dollars on just the spacecraft and rocket, only to have the spacecraft scrapped and the rocket relying on refurbished second-hand engines. It's utterly laughable. According to current public information, the Artemis 2 mission is scheduled to conduct the last crewed circumlunar flight using the Orion spacecraft by April 2026. The Artemis 3 mission in 2027 is supposed to achieve crewed lunar landing, followed by 8 more crewed missions between 2028 and 2035, an extremely intensive schedule after the Orion spacecraft is retired. The derivative model of SpaceX Starship will serve as the crewed lunar lander for the Artemis 3 mission. However, the development of SpaceX Starship is severely behind schedule. The spacecraft is not expected to be ready until at least September 2028. In response, NASA's acting administrator has floated the idea of bringing in competition like Blue Origin to rival SpaceX, hoping to speed up progress, a move that has left Elon Musk deeply dissatisfied. As for China's lunar exploration program, it has already completed the escape test of the Mengzhou crewed spacecraft, the landing and liftoff test of the Lanyue lander, and the captive firing test of the Long March 10 lunar rocket. The plan is to launch Chang'e 7 in 2026 for uncrewed test of a lunar orbit. The plan is to launch Chang'e 7 in 2026 for uncrewed tests of a lunar orbiter, lander, rover, and a lunar surface aircraft. Chang'e 8 will be launched in 2028 for lunar landing rehearsal, with a goal of achieving crewed lunar landing by 2030 to conduct preliminary exploration for the establishment of a lunar base. A clear comparison reveals that China is following a steady, step-by-step approach, focusing on the consistency and sustainability of long-term exploration missions. In contrast, the US Artemis program originated from a politician's arbitrary demand: get to space as soon as possible. It is truly astonishing how obsessed the United States is with winning, an obsession so intense that it seems to defy both economic and physical laws. After all, didn't the US already land on the moon back in 1969? For decades afterwards, no one country followed suit. So why the desperate need to compete now? This relentless desire to win truly makes the US the undisputed champion of the win at all costs mindset. Well, there's not much more to say. We can only smile and wish our American counterparts success in their one sided race.